Welcome to Concept Check, a new weekly video series that discusses various concepts within the field of esports and how they relate to each game. My name is Shay and I will be your host. Each of the episodes will begin with a general explanation of the week's topics and then delve into specifics for each game. Should you only be interested in a particular game, such as Starcraft or League of Legends, annotations on the screen or hyperlinks in the description will bring you to the section you're looking for. The inaugural topic for Concept Check is First Order Optimal Strategies, better known in esports and competitive gaming as cheese. Cheese is present in every game in one form or another, and while the definition shifts, the sentiment that people who employ these strategies have less merit to win or input less effort into the victory seems to be fairly pervasive. In order to understand the impulsive negative emotions associated with cheese, we should first define first-order optimal strategies, hereby referred to as FOOs, with all credit to the extra credit crew. A FOOs is an element of gameplay that has the lowest ratio of skill to results. In other words, it is the easiest strategy in the game to execute and the highest win rate or reward. In esports titles, FOOs vary from specific champions, build orders, or guns, and while the drawbacks or conditions may vary, the constant is that they are easy to execute in relation to other strategies in the game. FOOs are all born out of a simpler principle. They reduce depth or complexity in a game in their execution. Rather than engaging all of the game's mechanics, some are stripped away, allowing the player to concentrate on a reduced amount of things. By reducing the number of things a player must be constantly aware of, it is becoming far easier for them to execute their FOOs. One of the most prolific examples of a FOOs is the AWP from Counter-Strike. This sniper rifle has a one-shot, one-kill trait, meaning that a player need only hit another player once to kill them. It is a ridiculously high accuracy and very competent zoom. In designing the AWP as a FOOs, the game designers eliminated multiple shot recoil, character tracking, where you have to land subsequent shots on one player, and ease the nervousness of close counter engagements by allowing them to have such a high and accurate range. The reason many people get frustrated when playing against FOOs is because it is in their very nature. Because the player employing FOOs is playing with reduced mechanics, it often feels as though they are exploiting the game and not putting in as much effort as their opponent. Sometimes it feels unfair, that the opponent has an easier time playing the game because they are doing something simpler. As a player is subject to FOOs, sometimes the question of, why do I even try, comes up. Why should you try to get better if you could be doing something much easier and winning? To answer this question, we should look at why FOOs are necessary in games in general. They provide a lower barrier to entry for a new player to the game. Rather than having to absorb all of Starcraft 2's complex mechanics, a player can just focus on a very simple and easy build order and have a chance of winning the game. By zergling rushing, a player doesn't have to worry about scouting, supply blocks, map awareness, or expanding. However, he does still have to worry about unit production and unit micro, at a very small and manageable level. Allowing players to ease into the game's depth with FOOs makes them feel victorious and progressive. They have small incremental successes right off the bat, rather than being forced to learn all of the qualities of a game and play against people who have more experience at doing the self-same thing. But if FOOs only offer easier accessibility to a game, what place do they have at an esports level, where all mechanics are understood and partially mastered? Well, another good quality of FOOs is that many of them are interaction independent. They often do not hinge around reacting to your opponent or interpreting information and adjusting your playstyle based on that. They are blind actions that are good most of the time. An AWP is an AWP. A zergling rush doesn't care for what your opponent is doing. Because of this, FOOs offer gameplay diversification. If they are doing something that is independent of an opponent's actions, they allow for more viable strategies in the game. While interaction can and often is added to FOOs to make it even better, this high-level strategy and consideration simply offers and adds to their viability. Now, if FOOs are so good and easy to perform, what is the point of trying to do anything else? This is the most delicate part of designing a FOOs. The designers have to make it easier for them to be executed with a high win rate, but they cannot make them overpowered. If something is too easy and wins all the time, the game is fundamentally broken because all depth has been drained. Instead, it boils down to a binary yes or no equation. Did I execute the FOOs properly? Then I should win the game. This happened in a big way in Starcraft 2's early history. A strategy called the 1-1-1 was effectively unstoppable in the Protoss vs Terran matchup if the Terran executed it properly. The Protoss could be told it was coming from the game's offset and would still lose the game. It spiraled out of control to a point where Protoss players went years without winning the most prestigious tournament in Starcraft, the Korean GSL. Another important thing in FUs is that they should still allow for the better player to be better. A newbie should not be able to execute a FUs as well as a professional player can. While they are easier and the skill within them is shallower, there should still be a differentiation allowed in the skill ceiling. FUs have to be strong enough to be viable, easy enough to entice new players, and preventable enough to not cause the game to devolve. While the most obvious form of first-order optimal strategies exists in StarCraft 2 as a variety of early-game shenanigans, they are present in nearly every competitive game. Let's take a look at these strategies in 4 categories of the big eSports: StarCraft 2, League of Legends and Dota, Csgo and COD, and Hearthstone. StarCraft 2. A few weeks ago, somebody posted in r/Starcraft asking why we call everything cheese, and the undertone was frustration with how upset people became when cheesed are all in. For semantics' sake, a cheese is a strategy that relies on limited information to be successful, and an all-in is a strategy that relies on crippling the opponent or else the game is over for the attacker. Many cheeses are also all-ins, and many all-ins are also cheeses. Both types are FUs. Proxies are the most common type of FUs in StarCraft 2. You don't have to build any workers, and you don't have to manage all the elements of the game. They also don't account for what the opponent is doing. The reason that proxies aren't overpowered is because they have a very easy and obvious counter: scouting. If a player sees a proxy's building early enough, there is a linear and mapped out solution in order to minimize or negate any damage. 2-base Protoss or Zerg all-ins and Terran SCV pulls are more complex FUs. They do involve a certain level of all-game mechanics, but the reason that they are so popular and so successful is that they aim to end the game before the intense multitasking and build order free-flowing gameplay of the endgame comes in. Sometimes a particular race's late game is easier to control than another's, such as in PvT, and sometimes a race suffers at the highly effective units lose their potencies, such as sentries in PvZ. These sorts of FUs often do have some sort of reactivity, such as Zerg all-ins that are only effective against a fast 3cc Terran, or Terran SCV pulls which are only effective against Colossus openings. A huge part of FUs in StarCraft 2 is that they are not present in other games is limited information. Most of the FUs in StarCraft 2 hinge on other player not knowing what they are coming. This is the great equalizer in these strategies. Usually, when a strategy gets to a point where it wins despite being understood and scouted long beforehand, the game is in a bad state. Immortal all-ins, Broodlord Infestor, and the aforementioned 1-1-1, and 4 gates. These are all infamous for being overpowered because they broke a fundamental resource in StarCraft 2, knowledge. League of Legends and Dota. While the focus here is on LoL, this applies to Dota as well. Dota, despite being more complex of a game in general, still does have FUs, such as the Skeleton King. There are few actual gameplay consideration to make for FUs in LoL. For a while, people tried a 5-man inhib rush, or some early game invade shenanigans. Currently, a fast level 2 Russian bot lane is the most standardized FUs. Both of these rely on opponent being unaware and caught out of position somewhat. In League of Legends, FUs mostly revolve around champions. Some champions are simply easier to play than others, to great success. Champions such as Ryze, Katarina, and Ashe all skimp out on certain mechanics to make them more accessible and easier to play for beginning players and professionals. We'll explore Katarina. Katarina is easy to use because she lacks several fundamental mechanics. She has no mana management, her wave clear is fantastic, and she has an extremely accessible flash, one target ability, and a single-click burst damage ult. A few years ago, she was a veritable insta-penta machine. So, what is it about League that makes easy-to-use champions not overpowered? It is in large part due to the counter mechanic. For each champion, there's another champion that is, in theory, favored against the first one. Some champions are safe, and a strong counter will rarely replace skill discrepancies. MOBAs balance their FUs by making certain champions strong against certain champions, and by being very quick to tweak numbers if that is not the case. And finally, hard-to-learn champions tend to have a higher potential level, allowing for favorable trade with Fuse champions if you have the skills. For instance, a good Ahri can charm Katarina out of a Shunpo and burst her down. While it is easier for Cat to jump to Ahri, if the Ahri plays well, the Cat's easiness can lead to her death. Csgo and COD. I once heard someone say that if you haven't complained about the AWP, then you've never played Counter-Strike. It is such an infamous gun, not only because it is so good, but because it is so good in the hands of somebody who, perhaps, isn't so good. It allows the less mechanically capable player to blow the more mechanically capable player away. It allows a single person to instantly disrupt good team movement with one shot. It's the big game changer. As frustrating as the AWP is, it's not considered overpowered, and it's been in the game for over 10 years. What qualities scale it back? Well, the most obvious one is the mechanic of buying in Counter-Strike. The gun is good, but it's relatively hard to get, at least in the early rounds. If you can get it early, it means that you've done well with other guns in the game as well. Another big reason that the gun stays is because if the game does go scrappy, you either have to be extremely lucky with no-scoping, or be very good with a different set of guns, the pistols. The AWP often won't straight out win a round, it exists to set up an advantage that other players can capitalize on. And a team full of AWPs is, at least in my experience, not a winning team. It is an asset to a team, not a team in and of itself. Hearthstone. Until a few weeks ago, Hunter Rush decks dominated the ladder. The frustrating thing about this deck was that it encouraged your opponent to play freely. The more minions that the enemy played, the more devastating Unleash the Hounds would be, or the more damning an explosive trap could be. While this strategy did prove a little too good and needed a nerf, a variety of rush decks and aggressive decks are often easier to play and put the onus on the enemy rather than on you. The randomness in Hearthstone intrinsically nerfs any aggressive decks, however, more than control decks. A horrible draw might end the game for an aggro deck, and while it can do the same for a control deck, the likelihood of this happening is much smaller. Clear cards and stall cards are in abundance in Hearthstone and allow for mitigation of bad draws. Because the early game is so fragile for an aggro deck, they suffer from the inherent RNG present in all card games. Especially with powerful board clears in Hearthstone, a slow-rolling aggro deck may have all of its momentum stopped and be doomed to fail from the word go with a bad draw. This has been a short exploration of Fuse in competitive games. While the precise natures of them and their interaction with the mechanics of the game vary with whichever game is present, they all exist for the explicit reason of diversifying gameplay opportunities and easing new players into the game. It is just as very careful hand in their design, because they do strip depth and complexity from a game in order to achieve the above. If a designer doesn't take his due diligence in creating the proper Fuse, a game can be doomed. Thank you for watching. You're free to suggest a comment for the next week, and I check my Twitter most frequently of all the social medias. Constructive criticism, thumbs up, and subscribing always help. A special thank you to Extra Credit Crew for this episode, whose exploration of this selfsame topic inspired this show.